I always begin my lecture with this, which is an image from the exhibit, and I like to show it because, as you'll see, in the front is a samovar, and in the back are suitcases. And so it's the tension that all immigrants feel between trying to make a home for themselves wherever they are and the necessity to move. And the Russian Jewish immigrants were people who were thrust from their home, just as current immigrants from Central America are being thrust from their home. I live in the Ellsworth section of Sharon, which is up on the hill. If any of you have gone to Sharon across Route 4, you go up, 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 and when you get to the top, it levels off for a brief period. And there's an Ellsworth farm up there, which is a pick-your-own farm. And that's the section that I'm talking about of Sharon. The Jews were not, at least mostly, in the village at all. They came from the Pale, the Russian Pale, and I don't know whether you all know about the Pale, but it was the western part of Russia. Jews were, in the 19th century, were confined to this area. Other people lived in the area, but Jews could not leave it. It went from the Baltic Sea on the north to the Black Sea on the south, and as you can see, it was sort of bordered by the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Germany on the left, and then all of Russia. Jews who lived in the Russian Pale spoke Yiddish. Does anybody know what Yiddish is? It's actually a middle German, from medieval German. It was mixed with Slavic and Hebrew, and it was written in Hebrew. So the Jews in the Pale spoke Yiddish, and of course they spoke, because they were business people largely, they spoke Polish and Russian in their business dealings. And they were very, very multilingual. This is one of the pictures that I uncovered from a family who lived in Sharon. It's the only picture I uncovered, probably taken in the homeland. And these people were from Slutsk, as were many of the Jews who came to Sharon, the Rothsteins. And Slutsk was in the Ukraine, and that's where many of the Jews came from who came to Sharon. This is a list of restrictions on life in the Pale, and I feel like I can't go through all of it because I'm having a very short lecture. But basically, the main issue, there were two main issues really, the limitation of professional life and education, but they were forbidden. Russia was an agricultural society, and if you didn't farm, you were considered a parasite. So Jews were not allowed to own land or farm, and thus were limited to what were considered parasitical professions. Also very, very burdensome, every Jewish village had a conscription quota, and the rabbis of the village had to come up with the right number of Jews. So Jewish conscription sometimes went down to age 12. This is one of the Jews who ended up in Sharon. He was named Naftali Merkin in Russia, and when he came here, he renamed himself Harry Marcus. And he served in the Russian military for 25 years and never said a word about it. Well, life went on in the 19th century, and it was pretty hard for Jews. But in 1880, the Tsar was killed, Tsar Alexander. And when he was killed, the government instigated pogroms against the Jews, accusing the Jews of having assassinated Tsar Alexander. This is a photograph that I found of a pogrom. As you can see, many dead, and they're wrapped in the Jewish talit. So between 1880 and 1914, there were periodic pogroms, and 2 million of the 5 million Jews in the Pale actually fled Russia. So if you can imagine it, more than a third of all Jews fled Russia. Most of them made their way to European ports, and from thence on to America, which they did via steerage. And steerage, as I only discovered in doing this research, had a 10% mortality death rate. It was a really rough passage. Some Jews also arrived ill and were turned back at Ellis Island. But you can see these are Jews standing, and some of them again in their tallit, standing for the voyage, standing for much of the voyage. They actually had bunks on which they both ate and slept. This is one of the families that came here, and I'm going to pause to talk about Malka Chazanova because she came alone with a son. Her husband had been killed. And Jews who came alone, Jewish women who came alone were marked LPC, which meant likely to become a public charge. And often if they were marked LPC, they were not allowed in. But somehow Malka Chazanova got herself in, and the story then goes on from there. She became an Arnoff, and an Arnoff is one of the prominent names in our area. And actually Arnoff Moving and Storage is a big name in Poughkeepsie, just across the border. So they came mostly to New York's Lower East Side, which was crowded, and they were often peddlers there, as they had been in the Pale. But they also did a lot of work in the needle trades, where many of them actually succumbed to tuberculosis. So going back to Russia, the idea was that among student movements, people, among young people, that Jews needed to find a country where they could be farmers, that only if Jews became farmers would anti-Semitism end. So there were two student movements. One was Bilu, which said Jews need to go to Palestine, which is the Holy Land, and become farmers there. And the other was Am Olam, and said, no, Jews don't need to go back to Palestine. Wherever they can become farmers, that will be fine. And this is a photograph actually of Woodbine, New Jersey, which was a huge Jewish farming community in New Jersey. One great hero of this Jewish farming movement was Baron Moritz de Hirsch, who was actually a German by birth but became Belgian, and he dedicated a huge amount of his money. He was a speculator and built the railroad from Vienna to Constantinople. And he said, I'm going to give my money so that Jews can become farmers in a place where they will be treated with respect. And as a result of his money, he created the Jewish Agricultural and Industrial Aid Organization on the Lower East Side, which lent Jews money for mortgages. And about half the Jews who came to Sharon had mortgages from the Jewish and Industrial Aid Society. I'm showing a picture of the little boys selling the Forward, which was the Yiddish newspaper, because the Forward was where the ads appeared for land, which they could buy up here. You may have heard that there were also Jewish farm communities in Colebrook, in central Connecticut, and in Massachusetts, and so on. This is a page of the Forward with some ads. You can't read it very well, but it tells you that there are farms for sale and how many acres there are and so on. This was the JAIAS, is the Jewish Agricultural and Industrial Aid Society, and this is just for 1916. I did it as an example, how many Jews took loans and therefore went to New York, Illinois, Connecticut, New Jersey, Michigan, and Massachusetts. Now, Michigan and Illinois are further away. They actually went all over the country, but it's interesting that Illinois and Michigan had a fair number of applicants, and what I've heard is that people were told it had the same kind of terrain as the Ukraine. So the Jewish Agricultural Society developed a number of supports. Jews had never been farmers. There was no reason for them to know how to farm. And the society created educational structures. It created agents who would come and show them what to do. It created newspapers that would show them how to, just as many supports as it could think of to help people who had never farmed become farmers. This was a monthly magazine put out by the Jewish Agricultural and Industrial Aid Society called The Jewish Farmer, and here you see that they're being shown about cuts of about dairy farming, and all the Jews in Sharon were dairy farmers. about buying tractor equipment. And then on the right, yes, on the right you'll see that there was a Baron de Hirsch Agricultural School that was in Woodbine, New Jersey, and it was actually a school for the kids of the Jewish farmers so that they would continue to farm. And as you see, that's in English because the assumption was that the kids were learning English. So why did they come to Sharon? If you've been to Sharon, it's a pretty waspy place. Well, it was on the New York Central train line, and so it was easy to get to. They could go up in a day, look at property, and get back to their jobs. This is the Sharon station as it looked then, with horse-drawn buses, and the house in the background, which you can barely see, is actually a Jewish-run hotel. This is a census page from 1920, and what's interesting about it, which I suppose you probably have difficulty seeing, is that in the Ellsworth area, the land of birth, which is one of the questions on the census, was Russia, 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 Russia. So just a map of the farms purchased in Ellsworth between 1907 and 1940. Some of these farms went through several Jewish farmers. The problem with farming in Ellsworth was that it's high up. If you've been there, you know that it's high up. It was stony. It was very difficult to grow enough grain to feed your cattle. Once you had the milk, you had to come down a very steep hill, and then you had to cross this quite precarious bridge. As you can see, it's wooden planks, and take it across the Housatonic River. Sorry, I'm going too fast. I don't know. I'm not coming. Anyway, to a milking company that's on the other side. This was one of the first farm purchases, and it was by the Osofsky brothers, Nathan and Mendel, in 1907. This is a picture actually taken in 1929, by which time Mendel's son was actually graduating from City College in New York and was going on to medical school back in Scotland, because it was hard to get into medical school if you were a Jew in America. This was the farmhouse that they bought, a photograph taken by the Sharon records, the town records, just before it was torn down. This is Max Osofsky's son, Harry. And this is an interesting photograph only because what it shows is that, so here's Mendel or Max Osofsky and his wife, but who's with them is Baruch, and Baruch is the son of Mendel's sister, Mendel and Nathan's sister, and she and another sister had actually made the choice to go to Israel. So even within a single family, if they were interested in farming, some went to Palestine and some went to the U.S. This is Nathan with his wife and the first of their children, 4 girls. They would ultimately have 3 girls. They would ultimately have 4 girls and 4 boys. And this was the house they bought after they separated from Max. And because Nathan had gotten tuberculosis, they actually turned the house into a bed and breakfast, a kosher bed and breakfast for Jewish families wanting to come up from New York for a kosher vacation. In the very back, you'll see what was called a kochelein, which was a place where Jews who didn't have the money to be fed could do their own cooking. And that house still exists, and the kochelein is still there, not used. Here you see the end of the house where they made. When we first moved to Ellsworth, you could still see the tiniest rooms that were set up to be rented. It was extraordinary what people accepted for a vacation. Another house that was owned in Ellsworth by the Rothstein family. A couple of pictures of other Rothsteins. There were three sons who actually came, 3 Rothstein brothers, and first lived in Ellsworth and then later moved to Amenia. Here's Naphtali Merkin, who is now Harry Marcus, and his family of, I think at that point he has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Yes, he has 8. his wife looking fairly exhausted. And here's the house they lived in on Modley Road, which is actually about a half a mile from where we live. An insurance policy. Another family, this is a very interesting story. The Lubanskis also came from Slutsk, and the families went, it's a brother and sister, so the husband of the family on the left and the sister his sister is the woman on the right who married Raphael Epstein. Well, he died of the Spanish flu in 1917, by which time she had 2 sons who you see in this picture. And she came all the way back from Los Angeles, and the sons were raised then by the Lubansky family. Here you see the one-room, the school bus that took the kids to the one-room schools. Lovely picture. Up in this, and here you see one of the one-room schools, and the little girl in the white dress is Lottie Marcus, one of the Marcus kids. This is one of the later families to come. The Gorkovskis and the Weinsteins actually shared this house, and then later the Temkins bought it from them. And Louis Temkin, who actually did not farm, became a horse and cattle dealer. The house got changed. Somebody put a porch around it. And this is another family that is actually has still been in the area. And Louis Gorkovsky, who is the little boy in this picture, died at 94 2 years ago, and was still farming in our area. Another family that is still in our area, the Paleys. They've been there for 4 generations, and they're still farming. And if you ever go west past Sharon toward Amenia, you'll see Paley's Farm Market, which is selling vegetables. So 4 generations. In 1917, the Jews actually had enough of a group to apply for a kosher butcher, which is called a shachet. And the Schoifetz, 2 very similar names, came up, and Jake Schoifet was raised in Ellsworth and then in Sharon. And as I write, Jews they had garbage thrown at them when they moved into town. But Jake Schoifet was a World War II decorated hero, and he always thought that once Jews actually shed blood for America, that things got easier for them. So in 1918, the Osofskis moved to Amenia, and this is the beginning of all of these families, these 30 Jewish families, one by one, moving to Amenia. It was just too hard to be dairy farmers in Sharon, and Amenia was also more welcoming. And when the oldest daughter, Freda, wanted to go to school in Sharon, to high school, they'd been fine in the one-room schools up in Ellsworth, but when she wanted to come down to Sharon to go to high school, she wasn't allowed to come. So for the first year, Freda, who you see on the top row with the little fur collar, for the first year of high school in Amenia, and then the Osofskis thought, well, we need to move to where, because they had 7 more kids to get through high school. So they moved to Amenia, where they became hoteliers, hotel owners, and all their kids went to high school, and all 4 of the Osofsky girls became teachers, and all 4 of the Osofsky boys became farmers. And the Osofsky boys' grandsons are now of dairy farmers. They run Ronnybrook Dairy. Does anyone know Ronnybrook? They have it's kind of a boutique dairy that sells milk in a bottle. It's in Pine Plains. So here is Rebecca, Freda Osofsky on the left, who was a teacher, and she married Alfred Doobie, who was a traveling salesman who had come up from New Milford. And this is if you've come past come along in Amenia, you will have seen Doobie's Department Store. It still has that sign, even though it hasn't been Doobie's Department Store for many years. This was Amenia High School that let the Jewish kids in. And a number of Jewish kids in this later picture. At the time the Jews established, they were basically establishing a kosher vacation resort in Amenia, but there was still a place right around the lake, which was very small, but was still a lake, that was forbidden to Jews. Here's a map of where the Jewish resorts and businesses were. And I have to say that this development of resorts built by farmers who came down, it was also near the train line. It completely parallels the building of Jewish resorts in the Catskills, which were also began as farmers, and then they added on places where they could take in vacationers. So this was the Lakeview House by Philip Rothstein. Another picture of that. Here's Maple Lodge, another Rothstein boy, Sam. Harry, the third son, his summer resort. This is the Amenia business section, which looks pretty much like that today, if you've ever been there. On the far right is now a gas station. In 1929, enough Jews had moved down from the mountain, from Ellsworth, and the Jewish resort was really thriving. And the Jews got together and built a little synagogue, which still stands, Congregation Beth David. I think it had 67 seats, has 67 seats. Maybe it's a little more now because there are pews. And this is a lovely sign that they built. It was to remember those who had given money to pay for the building of this congregation. This is in Yiddish, but the Jews had now been in America for probably almost 30 years, and they didn't know the word for mortgage in Yiddish. So they actually use mortgage and write it in Hebrew letters as it would have been written as a Yiddish word. But if you look at the list of people here, it's all the families that I've mentioned. And here was one of the early bar mitzvahs of David Lubansky. And that's it.